Good morning, everybody. I'm David Faulkner. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to give my presentation about Fawdon House, better known as the Northumbrian Piper Public House. You might first of all ask, well, where does my interest lie? Well, I do occasionally enjoy a pint and sometimes a meal at the Piper during non-lockdown times. I was for 14 years a Newcastle City Councillor for the ward that covers Fawdon and Red House Farm, where the Piper is located. I attended meetings of all sorts of community groups there over this time, so I'm familiar with the building. I've also been a member of the local history society, history being the subject that I studied at university, albeit a very long time ago. So putting all of this together and additionally, being prompted, and somebody's mentioned this already, by David Olusoga's very interesting occasional television series, A House Through Time, I decided to start researching the occupants of Fawdon House through Ancestry, through Find My Past, through Google, aided and abetted by one or two other interested and knowledgeable parties, notably Joan Griffin, former licensee, and Eric Gatting, who is here, and to whom I'm grateful for the help. When I started on this research journey, I kept reading that the building that's variously been referred to as Fawdon House, Fawdon Hall, Fawdon Lodge, and now the Northumbrian Piper, was built around 1848, and the sources that I came across, for example, Tyne-Wear Sightlines, which is the official historic environment record, mentions 1848 without proof, without source, but I have read it on more than one occasion, and they quote the building as a dower house. Now, a dower house is one which is made available for use by the widow of a deceased estate owner, as you probably know, and the widow, the dowager, usually moves into the dower house from the larger family house on the death of her husband if the heir is married, or on his marriage if he was single at his succession, and the new heir occupies the now vacated principal house. Well, all sources are agreed that Fawdon House was built by Matthew Bell of Woolsington Hall. But was it for his widowed mother? Matthew Bell was an MP for Northumberland for more than 20 years in the 19th century, and he was JP, Deputy Lieutenant High Sheriff, and you see this quote here, regarded as a typical English country gentleman. Interesting storyline. You can read more about him on the parliamentary website, worth having a little look. The Bell family had acquired the township of Fawdon, such as it was then, and the surrounding land in 1768. And the family developed and built up coal mining interests in the area. Matthew Bell's father, Matthew Bell Sr., did die quite young. He died in 1811 at the age of 43. But his widow, Sarah, lived on to a ripe old age, and she didn't die until 1866. In Cheltenham, she was almost 100. And anyway, this really begs several questions. Why did Matthew Bell MP not build a house for his widowed mother on the Woolsington estate itself when he had so much land? If it was 1848, why did he leave it 30 years or more after his father died and after he himself was married to build a dower house for his mother at Fawdon? Was there an earlier dower house somewhere else that she didn't like and wanted something new later on? Was the house in Fawdon built for somebody else in the family, maybe a widowed sister and not his widowed mother? Matthew Bell himself died without issue in 1871, no children, so it couldn't have been built for a widowed daughter. Well, there's other evidence that suggests the house was built before 1848 and not as a dower house. And I'm going to now talk about a Mr. John Lambton Lorraine, later Sir John Lambton Lorraine. And he was part of the Lorraine baronetcy of Kirkhall, Kirkhall just west of Morpeth, and he was briefly the 10th to the title. And he was the official postmaster of Newcastle. I think he was the first postmaster of Newcastle. And we know that he lived in Fawdon in the 1830s and probably until 1844. And there's a book called Local Collections, a record of events of 1841. And in there's a record of appointments to the board of Newcastle Infirmary. And one of these is John Lambton Lorraine of Fawdon House. And there's a newspaper notice that records his wife gave birth to a son in Fawdon. Another reference is a House of Commons report of people appointed as JPs in 1841. And John Lambton Lorraine Fawdon is included. And in the 1841 census, the first census, there he is at Fawdon with his large family of wife and 5 children plus 6 servants. In the official Lorraine family history, you can see the book there, I've got a copy of it. It's recorded that he moved to Fawdon at the time of his marriage, 1835, and he stayed until 1844 when he moved closer to Newcastle city centre. But this family history says that he lived at Fawdon Lodge, not Fawdon House. Now, those of you who followed genealogy and looked at census records and so on will probably know this, but were the houses at Fawdon known by different names at different times? Very often, those who filled in the census were not very careful about names of people or places. The birth certificate in 1836 for Janetta Lorraine, one of John Lambton Lorraine's daughters, records the abode as Fawdon Grange. So what houses existed in Fawdon at the time? And the census of 1841 identifies a township of Fawdon that, excluding the houses occupied by the mining families, which were a little way down the road, totaled 46 people. There were agricultural labourers and their families, plus John Lambton Lorraine's household of 13 people. And as I said, the census just says Fawdon, it doesn't say Fawdon House. Did the Lorraine family live in a farmhouse? But Lorraine isn't a farmer. It's never described as such, either on the census or anywhere else amongst the many references to him in newspaper accounts. He is the postmaster on the census. By the time we get to the 1851 census at Fawdon, Lorraine's family have moved by then, but we still have no mention on that census of Fawdon House by name. But we do then have a William Robson, proprietor of brewery in one house in Fawdon, obviously a large house. And there's a definite record of Fawdon House in a gravestone, headstone inscription at Headon on the wall for this man, William Robson. It says, sacred to the memory of William Robson, who died at Fawdon House on April the 12th, 1851, in his 66th year. Actually, just a handful of days after the 1851 census was taken, it placed him in Fawdon. You're probably all doing your census in a couple of days' time anyway, so we can canny. But there he was at Headon on the Wall, which was the Robson family home. So that's where he was buried, but he lived in Fawdon House. Now, we know that the Bell family of Woolsington and the Lorraine family of Kirkhall were connected. Matthew Bell MP's brother John married Isabella Lorraine. So perhaps Matthew would be quite keen to provide a place to live for John Lambton Lorraine once he was ready to leave the family home at Kirkhall and when he got himself hitched. So what to conclude from all this? I'm pretty sure that Bell did not build a dower house in Fawdon around 1848. He might have built Fawdon House at some time between his father dying in 1811 and 1835, when we know Lorraine was almost certainly living there by then. Of course, there could have been an occupant before Lorraine, a Bell family member or somebody else. We don't know for sure. Maybe we'll never find out, but I've still got some more research to do on that particular score. And looking at Sir John Lambton Lorraine, as he became himself, here's the 1841 census that I just mentioned, and there he is as the postmaster. And I'm pretty sure he wasn't a farmer. So John Lambton Lorraine, as I said, his family lived at Fawdon House from 1835 until 1844. And he was a very important figure locally, not just the first postmaster for Newcastle, he was a justice of the peace, he was a captain in the Southern Regiment of Northumberland local militia, And in 1851, after he left Newcastle, he succeeded, albeit briefly, to the baronetcy to become the 10th baronet of the Lorraine family. He married late in 1835. He was age 51 at Morpeth Church to Caroline Elkins, who was the eldest daughter of the rector of Morpeth and Upham. And because he now needed a place of his own, and being head of the post office, which was located, the very first one was located in the old Royal Arcade in Newcastle, he took up residence at Fawdon, as the pedigree and memoirs of the family of Lorraine put it. And I'm quoting from that book again. Here he remained 9 years, and in February 1844, after 6 children had been born to him it said, he moved to Newcastle itself, staying for a short time in Adelaide Terrace before then moving to Eldon Square. He stayed in Newcastle until his succession to the baronetcy in 1851, but then because of his own failing health, which required a warmer climate, he moved with his children, or with some of them, to Jersey, where the family record says he died from intestinal inflammation in the following year. Probably more medical detail than you really needed, but that's what it says. There's a family brass on the south transept of St. Nicholas Cathedral in memory of Sir John, his wife, and their second son, William, who I'll say a word about in a minute because he was rather famous, even more famous than his father. So in this family pedigree and memoirs, it describes Lorraine. It says the 10th baronet was a tall, good-looking man with sporting proclivities, business-like instincts, a cordial manner, and a kind, chivalrous disposition, very popular among his friends and much beloved by his children. He was chairman of the Newcastle Races Committee. He was a member of the committee of the Newcastle Infirmary, chairman of the soup kitchen at St. Nicholas Cathedral. There was one then, kind of early food bank, and a patron of St. John's Music School. Lorraine's children, they were all born at Fawdon House. They were initially looked after after Dad died by Edward Lorraine as guardian. His successor, John's successor, who became the 11th baronet, was his son William. William was a very prominent naval officer. I'm just going to find something about him. Here he is. And on retirement, he was a rear admiral. He joined HMS Trincomalee. There's a picture of it there. At Valparaiso in early 1853, and he wasn't yet 15 years of age. The Trincomalee, some of you may know, was much later restored as a museum ship, and it's at Hartlepool now, in Hartlepool Dock, one of only 2 surviving frigates of her era. So that was his first naval service, but he rose to become commander of several warships, including HMS Niobe, and he became internationally renowned in something called the Virginius Affair, where as a commander of a ship, he intervened, diffused a really serious diplomatic incident that took place in Cuba, Santiago de Cuba, and saved the lives of very many people. And that kind of cemented his reputation. And if you disbelieve me saying that he was famous, well, you'll find his portrait in the National Portrait Gallery, and you'll find it in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. So here's a lad who was born in what is now the Northumbrian Piper. Now the Lorraine girls, they did quite well for themselves. Clara did best of all. She married Sir Andrew Fairbairn MP, who was a successful businessman. He was twice Lord Mayor of Leeds. He was a captain in the Yorkshire Hussars. She lived at the family home of Askham Grange near York, which is now a women's open prison, and in their London home at Portland Place. And that is when she wasn't hosting at their lavish third home and Biarritz. So not bad for a Fawdon lass, really. Moving on again then to that 1851 census. And we know, I've mentioned this headstone inscription in the churchyard at Heddon on the Wall, where the family came from, that William Robson lived at Fawdon House. We're sure of that. And the Evening Standard also reports his death at Fawdon House on the 12th of April, 1851, at the age 66. On that census, which I mentioned was just taken 2 weeks earlier, he's there with Lydia, his wife, with his sister Anne, with a nurse. So obviously, if he died a few days later, he was in very poor health at the time the census was done, and with 3 servants. He was the proprietor of a brewery, it says so on the census, and we know from other information. We also know it was called Bell Robson, his name and company, because that's confirmed by an entry in Ward's Directory from 1849, 1850. These old Ward's Directories, for those of you who like to do research, are absolutely fascinating. And we know that it was the most important of quite a large number of breweries in Newcastle at the time, and had existed for some years. Bell Robson and Company owned the Tyne Brewery, which had operated throughout the century under a variety of partnerships. It later moved from the Sandgate area by the quayside to a newly built brewery in Bath Lane. Does it sound familiar now? Which was said to be the largest premises that had ever been erected for brewing purposes in the northeast of England, and later became part of Scottish and Newcastle breweries. So William and his family must have moved in after the Lorraine family moved out. The local press carried an advert in 1845 for a sale of goods at the property of W. Robson Esquire, Fawdon House. After William died, his wife Lydia stayed at Fawdon House for a little while, but then went back to Walton, Cumberland, where she'd been born, to live with her sister Rebecca, who was a farmer. So now to some other people who lived in Fawdon House. And this one I picked up from the 1861 census. This is John Ingo, lived there with his wife, plus his nephew and his niece, lived at Fawdon House, very specifically says there, top left, Fawdon House, in the early 1860s. He was a ship owner in his own right, and with William Dogan and Robert Pratt, he was also a ship broker. In 1841, they operated from Broad Chair. Later, the company was wound up, but he entered a new partnership with Pratt, being replaced by somebody called Haswell, and they operated from the quayside. I've just put a picture of the quayside of the Times in there. Ship and insurance brokers, coal fitters, and general commission agents. And they seem to specialize in timber carriage. And they were amongst, I found, a number of Tyneside shippers who petitioned the Prime Minister, Robert Peel, in 1843 about changes to timber duties. And at the time of his death in 1877, he'd moved on from Fawdon House and lived at number 1, The Grove in Gosforth. You'll be familiar with it. He was described in that census in 1871 as a retired ship captain. So maybe he sailed his own ships too. So I'm going to now move to somebody who was famous in another field, and all of these people are living in Fawdon House in the Northumbrian Piper as it is now. John Furness Tone, a civil engineer. He was the engineer responsible for many important railway construction projects, initially in the northeastern Cumberland, but later also in the southwest and Scotland. He was advisor to the project that led to the building of the Forth Railway Bridge, which is why I put the picture there. And he was working with George Robert Stevenson, who was a nephew of the George Stevenson, on that project. He was also engineer to the Newcastle and Gateshead Waterworks. He advised on dock construction at Blythe and the reclamation of land at Morecambe Bay. He found time for civic duties. He was a councillor for Jesmond Ward on Newcastle Town Council. And when the British Association held its annual meeting in Newcastle in 1863, he contributed a paper on railways and locomotives on the rivers Tyne and Tees. He was a member and a major figure in the Institute of Civil Engineers, and he resided at Fawdon House from at least 1871 until 1876. Then if we look at the 1881 census, who's there now? Well, this is Arthur Dolby Wedgwood, familiar name. He's on the register in Fawdon. It says Fawdon Farm on that register, but some things to say about that. He was not a farmer, but he was the manager of an ironworks. There is no other reference in that census for Fawdon Township to Fawdon House or anything similar, so he must have been there. It's a large house because he has 6 children and 3 servants, And there he is, another one of these directories, Kelly's directory for 1886, described as iron merchant, Guildhall Chambers, Sandhill, residence, Fawdon House, Gosforth. So he's in Fawdon House. He was at Fawdon House for some time because 7 daughters and a son were born there between at least 1876 and 1833. Now, there were at least 6 separately owned ironworks in Newcastle at the time, so it's proving quite difficult to work out which one he managed. But because of that familiar name, I will say that his grandfather came from Burslem, Staffordshire, the Potteries, and they are part of the famous Wedgwood family. Their side of the family, Aaron Wedgwood and his descendants, were manufacturers of stoneware. So, famous name, living at Fawdon House. Here's another famous fella, John James Francis Hume. He was born in India. He was the son of Major General John James Hume. He became a brigadier general, was awarded a CBE. His portrait is in the National Portrait Gallery. I can't get my hands on it because it's protected, but I'll keep trying. This is the only picture I could find. It's rather overshadowed by his wife there, but there he is. He fought in the Zulu Wars between 1879 and 1881. That's the wars popularized by the Michael Caine film Zulu, Rorke's Drift, and so on. He was also in the First Boer War, where he was wounded, and he was mentioned in dispatches. Now, he served with the Northumberland Fusiliers, and there's a connection here because several people at Fawdon House, who lived at Fawdon House, were associated with the Fusiliers. And I suspect this was a connection that the Bell family probably developed. But he was mostly associated, John Hume, with the equally famous Connaught Rangers. He commanded the Welsh Border Infantry between 1910 and 1915, and he commanded the 160th Brigade at Gallipoli. So this is a story of over 40 years of military service, which is really quite exceptional. Then I went to the next census, and I came across this man, Captain Edward Bowes Eager. He lived at Fawdon House from at least 1891 until at least 1894. He was a captain in 5th Northumberland Fusiliers, the Fighting 5th. He fought in the famous Nile expedition of 1898, the Battle of Omdurman, for the Fashoda incident, for those who know that bit of history. And he was in the Second Boer War, where he died at the Battle of Belmont in 1899, part of a failed attempt to raise the siege of Kimberley. And there's a memorial plaque in his home church, which is St. Nicholas Church in Gosforth, funded through public subscription, so he's very much regarded as a hero. And his name is on the South African War Memorial in the Haymarket, which is the city's largest and oldest war memorial. His sons were both born at Fawdon House. One was called Francis Edgar Russell. The other one was called, wait for this, Harry St. George Eager. Harry St. George. Names to live up to. They both fought in World War I. Harry served with the 2nd Lincolnshire Regiment. He was awarded the Military Cross, twice mentioned in dispatches. And the latter, Francis, was a lieutenant in the Royal Artillery who was killed at Fleur Bay at the Battle of Obersreach in 1915. And then here's still the occupants of Fawdon House still have a connection with the Northumberland Fusiliers. Here from the 1901 census is Captain, later Lord Arthur Edward Lowther Crofton. He became the 4th Baron Crofton, which was family was from Roscommon and Ireland. He succeeded to the title much later in 1912, but he was made captain in the Northumberland Fusiliers from 1895. He was Lieutenant Colonel of the 12th Battalion Royal Fusiliers in World War I, and he was mentioned in dispatches there. He held the office of Deputy Lieutenant of his home Irish county of Roscommon, and he was what they called a representative peer in the House of Lords from 1916 until his death in 1942. So quite a long time. They rarely took their place, but the Union of Ireland and England created this group of people called representative peers, A limited number of them who had voting rights if they were interested, and he didn't spend too much time there. He was back in Ireland by that time. But interesting. Then I'm going to move to the 1911 census, and this is the last census, of course, that I've been able to look at. Next year, I'll be able to look at the 1921 census, and this is Benjamin Chapman Brown. He was company secretary and director at Hawthorne Leslie, famous Tyneside shipbuilding company, as you will know, and he was also lieutenant in the Royal Naval Reserve. His father, also Benjamin Chapman Brown, was chairman of Hawthorne Leslie for 30 years. His father served 2 terms as Lord Mayor of Newcastle, and he was knighted for his success in overseeing the Royal Jubilee exhibition. So the Browns began this link with Hawthorne Leslie, but then the Rowell family took over and continued this link, and I'm just going to talk about them in a moment. So Fawdon House had continued to be owned by the Bell family throughout this time. They'd been leasing it to soldiers and people in business and all sorts of other individuals. They hadn't wanted to sell the property, but eventually in June 1913, they did sell the property. So the people that I mentioned from now on were actually the owners as opposed to just tenants of Fawdon House. And as I say, I'm looking forward to seeing whether Brown was still at Fawdon House in 1921 in the census, or whether somebody else had gone there. But I have still the stories of 3 without the census. I've got the stories of 3 very interesting occupants to tell you about. And the first one is James Jimmy Raine. James Edmondson Raine, his full name. This is incredible. He was a very talented man in business, in the military, and in sport. He played as an amateur outside right for Sheffield United, for Sunderland, for Reading, and for Newcastle in the Football League. He also played rugby union for Percy Park and Northumberland County, and he played minor counties cricket for Northumberland as well. He was born in Winlayton Mill. He was well educated, Trinity College, Sheffield University. That's when he joined Sheffield United, his first club. He rose to become a major in the DLI. He fought in France with the 9th DLI in 1915, but he was invalid at home, but later returned with the 6th DLI. He was one of a handful of very distinguished amateur footballers to appear for the Magpies at the time. And of course, the club was kind of in its Edwardian heyday or just after that, and still attracted the best, especially those who, like Raine, were serving in the armed forces and they were stationed locally. His brother George was also with the DLI, and he died at the Battle of the Somme in 1916. George was also a footballer, a reserve team player for Newcastle. So James Raine, Jimmy Raine, played for the English League against the Irish League in 1907. He toured South Africa and America as a member of the England international amateur side. He won 10 amateur caps. In those days, all England amateur internationals against foreign teams were regarded as full internationals by the latter. Raine was a scorer in his first match, a 5-0 win over France at the Parc des Princes in 1906. He scored in victories against Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, and in 2 more games against France, a hat-trick in one of them. So quite an accomplished footballer alongside all of these other interests, both military and professional. When he died in Switzerland when he was taking the air, trying to recover from illness in September 1928. But all the obituaries refer to him being living at Fawdon House at the time of his death. And he was the managing director of the family firm of iron and steel manufacturers Raine and Company Limited at the Delta Works in Derwenthof in Gateshead. So, interesting and different story. And here's another one. This brings us back to the connection with Hawthorne Leslie. This is Robin Rowell. He was born in South Shields. He was educated at Repton School and City and Guilds Engineering College at the University of London. He began an apprenticeship with Hawthorne Leslie in 1912. In 1915, he joined the Royal Engineers, but he quickly transferred to the Royal Flying Corps, served in the UK with 1st Reserve Aeroplane Squadron and with the British Expeditionary Force in France, 1915-16. In 1916, he was appointed a captain, and he worked as an experimental pilot for the Aircraft Directorate and later the Designs Department of the Air Board. He carried out the first tests on man-dropping parachutes from an airplane, and he designed the casting-off gear. His story is told in this book, a book that is about him and his father. I've got this book too. Absolutely fascinating. Later, he joined the staff of Alfred Holt and Company, where he was involved in repairing and reconditioning the company ship. But he rejoined Hawthorne Leslie, became a director in 1922, managing director in 1936, and chairman 1943 to 65. So in that senior capacity, all of that time, or most of that time, he was living in Fawdon House. Hawthorne Leslie fared rather better than any other firm for naval work during the Depression years of the 30s. Between 1930 and 1934, it launched 9 warships, 4 torpedo boat destroyers for the Admiralty and 4 for the Portuguese government and 1 for India. And the foreign orders were achieved by the efforts of Robin Rowell. That was his forte of international connections and marketing. And his father, Sir Herbert Rowell, co-author of the book there, had been chairman of Hawthorne Leslie and responsible for laying the foundation for the continued success of the company. Now, perhaps the most famous ship built by the company in Rowell's time was HMS Kelly. It was launched in 1938, commanded by Lord Louis Mountbatten. It was a K-class destroyer of the Royal Navy, flotilla leader of her class. She served through the early years of the Second World War in home waters off Norway and in the Mediterranean. She was lost in action in 1941 during the Battle of Crete. Kelly had been commissioned on 23rd of August 1939, just 11 days before the commencement of hostilities. And she was named after Admiral of the fleet, Sir John Kelly, but forever associated with Mountbatten as commander. Now, Robin Rowell was a director of the Northeastern Electricity Supply Company, predecessor to where Peter Lowry and I worked. In 1949, he and his wife moved from Fawdon House to Wylam. He was awarded the CBE. He was knighted in 1952. He was a president of the Shipbuilding Conference and of the Northeast Coast Institute of Engineers and Shipbuilders, and a chairman of the Council of the British Shipbuilding Research Association. He stepped down as managing director of Hawthorne Leslie in 1962, but he remained chairman until his retirement in 1965. So the last person I'm going to tell you about, and the last person to live there before it became a pub, but he lived there for the best part of 20 years, is Colonel Robert Mould Graham, accountant, businessman, local politician, war hero. And I must mention his wife, who was a significant person in her own right, Jocelyn Mould Graham, MBE. I'm trying to get a photograph of her. Born in Newcastle, Robert was a survivor from start to finish of World War I. He was colonel of 272 Royal Field Artillery. In 1939, he left Newcastle to participate in World War II, British Expeditionary Force, Dunkirk, the North Africa campaign, the Salerno landings, finally returning in 1946 from the government of the Amalfi Coast. His wife apparently said that he was the last man in the regiment to come home. Now she, Jocelyn, had a lifelong association with a place called Alton Pancras in Dorset, as her paternal grandfather had owned the land of the parish, but she was born in Dublin in Fitzwilliam Square. Her maternal grandfather, Sir John Ross, became the last Chief Justice of a united Ireland. Her parents moved to Pitt House in Dorset in 1921. She went to school in Bournemouth. She became a talented fencer. She was shortlisted for the British Olympic team in 1928. In 1935, she trained and became a Conservative political agent. She was sent to Newcastle, where she met Robert, and she was elected to Gosforth Urban District Council in her own right. After his first wife had died, they married in 1937. So with Robert away on military service, Jocelyn remained looking after baby Joanna and her 13-year-old stepdaughter, and she organized an army of knitters to provide woolen clothing for the forces through the Northumberland and Durham War Needs Fund. And it was for that she received an MBE in 1945. Robert had been elected a Newcastle City Councillor for Elsick in 1933. He wasn't re-elected in 45, but he came back on the council as an alderman in 1949. Amongst his many important roles were as chairman of the council's transport committee. He had a special interest in the airport. Robert became sheriff for the municipal year 51-52, alongside the Lord Mayor, who was William McKeag of Newcastle United family fame. And then Robert himself was elected Lord Mayor, with Jocelyn as Lady Mayoress, of course, for the municipal year 55-56. And one of his last civic engagements in that year was at Wembley with the official party to see Newcastle United win the FA Cup. Sadly, the last such occasion that the club had won domestic silverware. Other highlights of his year were the first visit to Newcastle of the young Queen Elizabeth in October 1954, and a ceremonial visit to Nancy, France. He was responsible for signing the town twinning agreement between Newcastle and Nancy, and it's a relationship that survives to this day. And when I was on the council, I twice had the opportunity to be associated with that town twinning link. Two more children had been born in 47 and 49. The family then bought Fawdon House. At that point, they needed larger premises. They'd previously lived in Gosforth. Sadly, their daughter Joanna died from leukemia in 1962. Robert was a JP. He was president of the Tyneside Chamber of Commerce. He was a member of the board of the North Eastern Electricity Board. There it is again. He became chairman of the Northern Counties Building Society from 1961. The society merged with the Rock Building Society in 1964 to become Northern Rock. And Robert Mulgraham of Fawdon House became the first chairman of the new company, which went on to be so successful, but then, of course, sadly, so controversial in the end. And Jocelyn was chair of the Northumberland Association of Youth Clubs. Upon his retirement from politics and then from business, the family moved to Alton Pancras in Dorset, where the manor house, which I mentioned about, the family link she'd inherited, and that became her new centre of hospitality. She continued in community works as director of the Victoria League, and later the national colonel commandant of the Church Girls Brigade. Robert died in 1979, and a memorial service was held at All Saints in Gosforth. Jocelyn survived till 2013, just a few weeks short of her 102nd birthday. Now, the Mulgrahams sold Fawdon House to Scottish and Newcastle breweries in 1968, and it began a new life as the Northumbrian Piper. And here is the Piper, Jack Armstrong, who actually played, official Northumbrian Piper, who played at the opening of Fawdon House as a pub, as the Northumbrian Piper. Now, there may have been tenants of interest between each of the census that I've been able to look at. My research isn't finished, and I certainly intend to continue with it. But I just think it's absolutely astonishing that one house has been the home of so many brave, interesting, influential people over 185 years. I actually think the story of Fawdon House is more, and its occupants, is more interesting than some of the stories that David Olusoga has been telling about Bristol and Liverpool and so on. So there we are, ladies and gentlemen. That is the story of Fawdon House before it became the Northumbrian Piper. One of these days I might do a postscript and find out a little bit about all the licensees, but I doubt whether they could have such dramatic stories as these people that I've been talking about in the last 40, 45 minutes. So there we go.